This exhibition represents work made between 1983 and 2019. The one thing that connects all the work, I started keeping a journal and I started collecting dreams. And one night I had a dream. I dreamt that I was in Santa Fe and I saw my work. It had the same texture, same forms. There are stories connected to each piece. This work represents 35 years of examples of different periods of work that I did during my teaching career at Texas Tech University. I started teaching in 1983 and retired in 2018. This piece here is a very, very important piece in the development of my work. It's one of my first double wall pieces. It was influenced by my first experience traveling to the lower Pecos Canyonlands. And I would collect clays and minerals and, for example, this photograph of eroded rock in the lower Pecos Canyon. And I wanted to come back to my studio and try to create this texture. So that's what's happening on the side there and also on the platter. And the lines and slip decoration comes from clays that I would collect while I would be in the canyon camping or hiking. These pieces are directly influenced by 4,000-year-old pictographs that I saw in Rattlesnake Canyon, which are shown in this photograph. So all the work will have a story. This series of work, the cauldrons, the double wall cauldrons, were influenced by my experience growing up in a farming family where my mother and grandmother made soap and they made hominy and they would even wash clothes in big cast iron cauldrons. And as a kid, my job was to keep the fire burning hot around the pot. And when I started making pottery, I wanted to make big cauldrons like this. But when I tried making them just single wall, they would warp in the kiln. So one night I had a dream that if I made them double wall, I could put them on tripod feet and they wouldn't warp because of the engineering element of it. The inner wall kept it from warping and kept the shape. So that led me to a whole series of other work related to that. So sometimes I'll work with an idea and then incorporate some other idea that I eventually invent or discover. These pieces were influenced by cotton gin cyclone dust collectors that you see in cotton gins. When I was a kid going to the cotton gin with my father, we would have to wait in line for hours to get the cotton processed. And I would draw these figures over and over because they looked like people. And as a kid, I would put arms and legs and heads on them. So when I moved to Lubbock, that sparked that memory. And I started using that as a point of departure for making these noble jars. And they're glazed with 22 karat gold, and the one over to the left has platinum. In this piece, I incorporated another influence. The piece over to the left was influenced when I was a resident artist in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, they do something that's very, very interesting and scary. They make their scaffolding for high-rise buildings out of bamboo. And when you walk around the buildings, they are very thin, but people are walking and climbing on top of the bamboo. And I just thought that was really interesting. So when I came home, I started playing with building a wire web around the pot and firing it. And the copper wire leaves a mark. So these pieces were influenced by when you fly over Lubbock and you see the irrigation circles and playa lakes. And depending on the time of year, you get a different texture, different reflection, different surface. These were made using dust from dust storms mixed with other iron elements and sprayed on top of the piece when it was still very hot, and it leaves this nice orange earthy texture. And these lines are horsehair laid on top of the piece when the piece is very hot, and it singes it and leaves a permanent mark. And then fuming and raku. Raku is a technique where you take the piece out of the kiln when it's in the molten state and put it in a container and add elements on top of it. In this case, I added shredded paper, and so you can still see slight shredded paper marks, which has a lot of texture, visual texture. And here, of course, I still enjoy making small pieces, although most of my pieces are large. I like that intimacy of making just a small piece that can be easily lived with. And these are different firing techniques. I co-authored a book called Alternative Kilns and Firing Techniques, where I show all of these wonderful techniques to get different textures and colors. And again, combining influences. I studied the martial arts. I have a black belt in Taekwondo. And there's a concept in the martial arts called relaxation and explosiveness. So the twisting of the forms, I wanted them to look as if they could move at any moment, as if I was capturing a sense of tension so that they look as if they can move quickly, or snap back, kind of a dancer. This one is even called Dancers. And this piece is called Guardians. In 2005, I made my first trip to Cambodia. I received a Fulbright Hayes Fellowship, and I got to see Angkor Wat and all of the amazing things that took place in Cambodia, and I was fascinated with the huge sculptures in Angkor Wat and the trees that have now surrounded many of the buildings, and they actually are holding up some of the buildings. The trees are called banyan trees. And so, even though I was already using the bird form and twisting them, I decided from looking at the banyan trees to make them longer and more sculptural, more lyrical, and using the faces from the sculptures and taking them apart, deconstructing them. The pieces on the wall in this section of the gallery were influenced by my teaching career, teaching architecture students for 35 years and watching the development of architecture. When I retired, the laser cutter was a very big tool that architecture students used. They used the laser cutter to cut out their models. So myself and some other artists and my colleagues, Lahib Jaddo and John Chen, they were investigating using the laser cutter to draw images on paper and wood. So I decided to take porcelain tiles. These are very thin porcelain tiles. They're 1, 2, 3. I put them together and I do drawings of my pots that were influenced by looking at pottery through the spy hole of the kiln. And there's a wonderful photograph of the spy hole. So you can look in and you can tell the temperature of the clay and the temperature of the firing by the cones, which are these things here. And they drop, each one drops over at a certain temperature. So when the last one falls over, it's 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a dramatic thing looking into that kiln. So I would do a drawing of pots, then send it to the laser cutter, put the tiles down, and the laser cutter cuts the image. And then sometimes I would make a stencil that I would then lay on top of the piece and then glaze around it. And they are fired multiple times, sometimes 10 times to get the depth and textures that you see in these surfaces. It's very time consuming. So I've decided that I'm going to work more with wet clay instead of the laser cut pieces. I like getting my hands wet. But before I stopped doing that, I made a series of prints, 6-screen prints, and also using the laser cutter. The silkscreen prints came about because I wanted to work bigger. I wanted to see the images bigger. So I elicited the help of Eddie Grisby, a professional printmaker, and we made these prints, and then I put them in the laser cutter with the help of a student, a graduate student, Joey Jeffrey, and we laser cut on top of the prints. So I started out with 12 colors, but when I started laser cutting over it, it ended up with 24 and even 30. You can see where when it laser cuts on top of the color, it creates a new color. And then when it creates even a different color. So in this one line, there are 4 different colors. And that happens throughout the whole composition. So it creates this multi-level image of forms and color. And then these pieces are covered jars, and each one has a story. The story behind the little piece is that the glaze was made from cotton hulls from the cotton gin. I would go out with a bucket and fill up a bucket with cotton hulls, come back, crush them, fire them, and make a glaze out of it. So this is the ash from the cotton hulls. And that was significant because Lubbock is considered the cotton capital of the world. More cotton is produced and manufactured here in Lubbock, so that's a very important piece to me. These pieces are also influenced by travels when I went to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Singapore, and I taught at the Ho Chi Minh City University of Architecture. And when I was there, I taught an architectural ceramic class and freehand drawing. And so with these pieces, I'm incorporating drawing and ceramics together, using gold luster again. This is a very important piece and has an interesting story. On my first trip to the Lower Pecos Wilderness, going to Rattlesnake Canyon to look at ancient pictographs, I got lost in the desert. I left very early in the morning because I wanted to beat everyone, the other 11 artists that were part of this group. And we were supposed to go through back roads in order to see the beautiful landscape and wildlife. And it started getting dark because I'd gotten lost. I got lost and I was going through dirt roads and crossing ravines and washes, and a snake crosses the road, the largest snake I've ever seen outside of a zoo. And it crossed the road and I accidentally, inadvertently ran over it, and it sounded like a speed bump. We went boom, boom. So I got out of the van, to look at what I thought was going to be a roadkill, and the snake was nowhere to be found. I was going to cut the rattle off and keep it as a souvenir. I got back in my van and I got real paranoid, thinking that the snake had wrapped itself around my motor and was going to crawl out and eat me alive when I opened the door. And I kept going, and I came across a group of cowboys who were herding animals, and they were on horses, and I tried to speak to them, but they didn't speak English, and I thought I'd crossed over into Mexico. So I thought, okay, I'm in my van, I'll just camp out. But then I went on down the road and I saw a pile of rocks with a piece of cardboard and my name and an arrow pointing in the direction that I should meet the other people. So as soon as I got back, I made this piece in homage to that experience. And it's called Snake Crossing. And more double wall pieces. This was called a bird basket. And on the inside, there's some wonderful drawing. Each one of these represents a different firing technique. And they were influenced by, when I was a resident artist in Japan at Shigaraki Institute of Ceramic Studies, and I got to see Shinto tories, and that stirrup-like shape I thought was very interesting, and the idea of passing through a gate. So these were influenced by that experience. And a lot of the pieces are carved. And when I was a kid, I helped plow the fields on my family's farm. We grew cotton and corn. And so these furrows were influenced by the carving on the pots were influenced by the furrows. These were influenced by also my experience in Japan. These are double wall platters, incorporating the bird forms. And there's a wonderful photograph of a goose at the lake and Mount Fuji in the background. So for me, these pieces have that memory of my experience in Japan, which was a phenomenal experience. Teaching drawing and using live models, I would take slabs of clay into the studio, and instead of drawing on paper, I would draw and paint on clay. When I was in graduate school, I had the opportunity to participate in tea ceremonies. And when I was in undergraduate school, my instructor would take us to the Nelson Art Gallery, and we would have the opportunity to hold Sung Dynasty tea bowls. So that made me really appreciate the tea ceremony and the idea of holding an intimate tea bowl and being able to look at it and get yourself into a meditative state by making references to color and shape that you would see in the tea bowl. For example, this piece here was made in Japan, and I'm using Shigaraki clay, which has tiny quartz crystals. And when you fire the pieces in the wood kiln, no glaze, just wood, the crystals melt and they look like raindrops or snowflakes. These pieces here are influenced by sunsets that you see in West Texas. This was taken in Junction, Texas, at the Texas Tech University Center in Junction, and I tried to emulate that with the glaze. And I wrote a book that accompanies the exhibition, has the same name as the exhibition, Reflections Made of Memories. And it consists of the 12 stories that explain the influences and motivation of my artwork with photographs. And it chronicles the 100 pieces that are in the exhibition.